So, when this Iron Curtain, or so-called Iron Curtain, descends, um, what happens in Eastern Europe? And for many people, this is a mystery as to uh, the Soviet occupation of this area. And when I mean by occupation, I mean that there are going to be Soviet um, tanks and troops throughout Eastern Europe from 49 on, really the end of the war on. But there's going to be governments put in place that are fully supportive of the Soviet Union, not necessarily by the people's choice, but through the playing of politics. So the Soviets don't have to direct policy by saying tomorrow you're going to do such and such, because the people who are now in place in Eastern Europe are fully versed on Stalinism and are followers of Stalin's version of communism. And well, what does that mean? Well, Stalinism as a ideology that's put into place means that there are two major ways of improving the economy, and there's economic principles behind it. And there's this two-prong attack of collectivization of agriculture and high industrialization of the economy that is under the umbrella of a national institution. So, in Hungary, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Romania, and places like this, there's this change from often agriculturally based societies now fully attacking their economy through industrialization. Whether that's viable or not to these areas was disregarded. It didn't matter whether or not these countries could support a fully industrialized economy in these generally agricultural regions. So, depending on the nation, from 46 to 1953, in many of these areas, is known as high Stalinism. So this Stalinist path is going to be followed in this region to a large degree. Why do I say 1953? Because in 1953, Joseph Stalin finally dies. And it's at that point that the Soviet Union has to finally change gears as to what will happen next, because Stalin had been in power since the late 1920s. So for a large number of time, he had been the guiding force. He was really the ideological force behind everything that happened in the Soviet Union, and now what was happening in Eastern Europe. So in places like Hungary, the Popular Front government is infiltrated by communists, and this is typical of the different areas. They controlled the Ministry of Interior, and this is the position they always wanted, which is it's kind of like the local FBI kind of arm of the government. The Ministry of Interior can handle police efforts and investigations. So you can set up people, basically. So if you control the Ministry of Interior, you can choose who your political enemies are and then eliminate them. You can either send them to jails, and many of these people are going to be sent to gulag type places, sometimes all the way out to the Soviet Union, or in eternal gulag type system, prison camps and such. And Rákosi, who was, I'll use this example, was one of these Moscow exiles. He had left Hungary in the 1920s following the failed communist coup in Hungary, and he had basically studied Stalinism and was a fan of Stalinism and was his perfect student, really. So Rákosi comes into power, and he sets up upon the typical path. What is a typical path? Well, first begin with your 5-year plan. You're going to devote most of your economic money towards industrialization. You're going to collectivize the farmland, and this always ends up in failure. Collectivization never seems to work, although it gets the peasants, it dismantles the power of the peasants. That is effective, yes. Whether does it improve agricultural production? No, it never does in Eastern Europe, never did in the Soviet Union, but it takes away the political threat of the peasantry. And in Hungary, it was still a very agricultural-based nation all the way up until the war. And so money is devoted to the creation of mines and other industrial products, and again, whether this is viable or not. And resources are going to be sent to various Eastern European nations for this to happen, and their goods will be sold to the Soviet Union. So it becomes like a little colonial government setup. You have the colonies of the Eastern European nations following the Stalinist style of government and fully supported the Stalinist government, but on their own in many ways, but also having this trade agreements between these nations. So to ease the burden of what's happening, they will sell among themselves. All the inefficiencies that happen in the Soviet Union also then spread to Eastern Europe as well. So there's too much production of bauxite and too little production of aluminum. And so when it comes to producing mass goods, which are never high on the agenda under the Stalinist system, people don't have what they need, basically. They don't have enough food in the stores. They don't have a variety of food. They don't have a variety of clothing and other goods. And plus there's also this ideological aspect of it. What do Soviet-style clothing, how should that look? What is Soviet-style fashion? And there's great studies out there, if you're interested, about how these fashion designers had to try to create clothing that would meet the, Stalinist approval, as that being too bourgeois, too Western, but yet serving the needs of women. And women, of course, throughout history want to look good and have makeup and these certain needs. And if you ever have a chance to read works by Slavenka Drakulic, who was a Yugoslav woman who writes about how the needs of women are never met during this time period, it's quite interesting. But these Soviet-style governments, also have a need to suppress any opposition. And this is the time period when we think of the show trials and which were trumped up charges against various members of the Communist Party or others who might be seen as a threat or questioning how this was all being worked out. And also internal enemies of the people. And in the Soviet Union, that could mean people who saw the West. Soldiers who went and fought against Germany, many of them ended up in the Gulag almost immediately in the Soviet Union because they had seen something else, and that was a threat to a Stalinist-style government. So this high period of secret police begins in Eastern Europe during this time period, and it's the worst time period really for many of these countries up until 1953. Some countries it's going to last longer, like Czechoslovakia, which doesn't seem to dismantle this program really until the late 1960s. And when reading Hedda Kovai's book, we see some of that, how it lasts quite long. But this time period of what we think of as a strong totalitarian, harsh government system where people are living in complete fear is now, or in that time period, really up until 1953 in most of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union has also lost control during this time period of Yugoslavia. Marshal Tito, who had led the communists against the fascists in Yugoslavia, becomes the leader of Yugoslavia, and he's not going to kowtow to Stalin. He was a very strong believer in how things should work out, and there's this break in Eastern Europe in the colonial system really. And Yugoslavia is going to go on its own path, but a lot of people were going to be persecuted in Eastern Europe for being Titoists, people who are somehow trying to break from the true path of communism. And that's going to be a charge laid out against a lot of leaders when there's going to be some revolutions that are going to break out that I'll discuss in this unit. But this is their main charge. They're looking for their own path because people realize quite quickly that the Stalinist path is not going to be a path to success, and it's not going to have the support of the people unless you are ruling by fear. Break away the fear, and then people have some new ideas in play. And many of the revolutions in Eastern Europe that happen are an adjustment to communism, not a full democratic revolution.